Oh hi, didn't see you there. Welcome back to SoundLearn. Today we're going to talk about something that for a very long time bothered me because I didn't understand what the actual definition was. What is a producer? Who is a producer, better yet? Am I the producer? Dude. You're not the producer. Anyway, welcome back to SoundLearn. Okay, that was dumb. Anyways, we're going to talk about what a producer actually is, what do they do, and what is that definition? Because it always seemed so elusive when I was getting into this industry and learning about everything. We're going to talk about some of the misconceptions of what a producer is or what they do, and just kind of run through the whole list of what defines a producer so that maybe you can hopefully understand what it is and what that means, and maybe if you are a producer yourself, maybe you need a producer. We're going to talk about all that, so let's just get straight into it. So most of you watching this video probably have a general idea of what or who a producer might be, but if you're watching this video and you don't even know what a producer is at all, maybe you might be shocked to find out that some of the producers that are very prolific might actually be behind some of the biggest songs you've ever heard. Off the top of my head, I can think of, well, a huge one would be Quincy Jones, who's done Michael Jackson stuff, Ray Charles stuff, and a ton of other stuff. You can look up his discography. You've got George Martin, who was behind, famously referred to as the fifth Beatle. He was behind all of the Beatles stuff. You've got Rick Rubin, who is kind of controversial if you ask certain people, but undeniably has had some huge hits with like the Beastie Boys stuff, some Jay-Z stuff, Red Hot Chili Peppers stuff. A lot of the most, even as far as something more obscure like the Mars Volta, he was very much responsible for some of the biggest hits from those artists, and he's undeniably a prolific producer. You've also got Max Martin, who I always found really funny, was behind both Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. The seemingly 90s boy band rivalry was pretty much all him. And he also did Britney Spears, of all people, and continues to make huge pop hits to this day. Point being is that a producer can help really elevate an artist's potential or a song's potential to its max, which is the goal. So to understand who a producer actually is, we need to understand where the term came from and when it actually started. Traditionally, a producer was somebody that was hired by the label to make sure that the album or single or record, whatever, got done on time in its best possible form, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that you had to have musical expertise to be a good producer. A good producer is somebody that the label knew could keep track of hours in the studio, book the studio that needs to be booked, book the session musicians that needed to be booked, made sure that everything was coming in under budget or on budget, trying not to go over budget, and generally trying to make sure that the record got done on time so that when the label said, here's the deadline, where's the record, the producer could be like, I did my job, everything's done the way you expected it, and here's the big single. Now, that's not necessarily what a producer does anymore, although that can be part of it, depending on your role. But the key part of that was that the producer, their job was to make sure that the song got delivered by the deadline in its best possible form. And I think what ended up happening is that the producer term only really held on to that part, making sure that the song or record is in its best possible form. So that's kind of what a producer does now. Now, producers are now usually tend to be a lot more musical, but that isn't necessarily always the case. Maybe a good producer just has an awesome array of contacts and knows the best drummer, the best keyboard player, the best guitarist, the best drum programmer, whatever it is. Maybe a good producer, that's all they need in their arsenal to be a good producer. And they obviously have a good ear and a good taste for music because they know who to get in the room to make it work. There's a ton of really good producers that aren't really great musicians. So that being said, I think it's important to talk about some of the misconceptions that come along with the term producer. When I started making music, it was in a garage band with my friends in high school, and it was all about, turning up the distortion on the guitar, being loud and messy, and, being raw, pure energy. And one of my earliest misconceptions that I had was that this idea that producers ruin the integrity of music. Somehow, like, it'll no longer be your track and it'll feel like this manufactured fake sort of thing when a producer gets involved. But that's not always the case. Remember, the key here is that a producer's job is to make your song the best version of itself. One producer that pops into my head is Steve Albini, who was famously very hands-off. He was behind Nirvana, the Pixies, a bunch of other huge bands in the 90s. And some people sometimes have worked with him in the past and complain like, well, yeah, all he did was like, you know, set us up and he just kind of hit record. And they were maybe expecting to go in there and magically come out as Nirvana. But that's not the case. A good producer in Steve Albini's case is that he understands the engineering side a lot more and understands how to capture that raw energy, whether it be mic placement, knowing how to get the best performance out of the band, whatever it may be. There's different ways to produce, and they don't always have to be super manufactured or overproduced. There's a bunch of different ways to approach that. So again, the idea here of a producer is to make your song the best version of itself. So don't think of it as somebody coming in and over manufacturing your song. While that is a possibility, that's not the case. That's not the goal with a producer. That being said, another misconception about a producer is that a producer can fix a bad song. That's just not going to happen. A bad song is a bad song. So you can't expect even the greatest producer to come in and fix your song. If you find yourself in a place where a producer is telling you that your song is not ready for the limelight, then odds are your song is not ready for the limelight. So you need to still continue to work on your craft until you feel ready to actually be produced. Another big misconception that I had about producing was that producers need to be great at music. They need to be great musicians. They need to know music theory. They need to be extremely prolific. While there's definitely some genius producers out there that understand music on a different level. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is somebody like Quincy Jones. You don't necessarily need to have that. For the longest time, that's something that I wanted to do. I wanted to be a producer, but I never had the chops as a musician. I'm not a musician's musician. And so like I always kind of thought to myself, I don't think I can produce. That's not something I think I'll be able to do. But the further and further I got in and the more people I got to know, the more I understood that there's plenty of producers who aren't necessarily great musicians, but they might have great musical ideas, as simple as they may be. Maybe they just have a really good session flow. They know how to run a session in Pro Tools or Ableton or whatever it may be. Maybe they're great at drum programming. Maybe they don't even do any of that. And it goes more back to the traditional sense of just being the right guy to connect all the right people together to make a great song. And so luckily I've been able to get into production because I came to realize that you don't need to be a great musician and you can still be a great producer. So go for it. If that's something you want to do and you're not a great musician, never hurts to have good chops, never hurts to, you know, learn a little bit more music theory. But maybe your lack of music theory and your kind of like obtuse approach to making music is what makes you attractive as a producer. So never lose sight of that. And remember, the end goal is always to make a song the best version of itself. So if you can do that without any music theory, power to you, you know? There still seems to be a huge misconception about the idea that producers are super expensive and you need to be on a label to use a producer. The reality is there's plenty of producers out there like myself that are constantly looking for cool projects to work on. At the end of the day, you have to also remember that a lot of producers, if not most, if not all producers, are in it because they love music and they like making good music. And so don't be afraid to shoot your shot if you come across a producer that you really like to present music that you think lines up with their style and is great. Because the reality is if I come across a band that has a budget of 0, but they have amazing songs and I genuinely believe that they might have something to offer in the music industry, then I'm going to go ahead and try to work something out, whether that's, you know, some sort of stake in the writing or whatever, to make it work so that we can make great music. That's it. That's all that matters at the end of the day. I want to make a great song and I want to be involved in that. I want to be able to say that I helped make this already great song sound better. So it's important to at least try. Obviously, don't be that guy that's just like trying to force your demo onto somebody. But if the opportunity presents itself to where you can show a producer a song that you feel has potential, but you don't necessarily have the budget for it, the worst thing that can happen is that a producer can tell you, wow, this is a great song. I know exactly who you can work with to kind of get this developed. That's the worst thing that can happen. Or they just say, hey, I don't like the song. So don't stop yourself from maybe reaching out to a producer because you think, oh no, like I need to be on a label that's way too expensive. You really never know. Now, on the other hand, another common misconception is that these days you need a producer. You don't. You don't necessarily need a producer. There's some great example of like self-produced records. I mean, the biggest one in recent memory in the like indie rock world would be Tame Impala. Kevin Parker does everything from the recording, the engineering. I think the only thing he doesn't do is, I think, the mastering and the artwork on all this stuff. But everything from the recording process, the writing process, onward production, that's all him. You know, you've got Tori Moore also produces a lot of his own stuff. Tyler, the Creator, his most recent album, I believe, was all self-produced. Pharrell Williams, who is also a very prolific producer, produces pretty much all of his own stuff. So the list goes on to show you that you don't necessarily need a producer to be the best version of yourself or have your music be the best version of itself. But it is important to ask yourself, do I need a producer? Should I be using a producer? And so that kind of leads me into the last kind of thing, which is the question of, should I be using a producer? Because maybe you don't, maybe you do. So here's a few reasons maybe why you would want to be using a producer, or you should be using a producer. The first one would be if you feel like you want to explore a new sound. This is pretty self-explanatory, but the reality of writing and producing your own music is that the only filter you have to go through is your own filter. So unless you have like really great self-awareness, or you're very experimental by nature and you're willing to try really weird stuff and to find something new, odds are you're gonna have your stuff kind of settling into some sort of pocket that feels like you, which is great, but can very quickly get repetitive if you don't have the right tools to kind of dig yourself out of that hole. A producer can be that second filter or that second person to bounce ideas off of, and can be useful in that sense. Another reason you might want to be using a producer is if you maybe know you have great songs and you have great chops, but maybe you're hitting a creative wall. A good producer can help you break out of that by taking your music into a completely different genre, or maybe exploiting the genre you're already in. An artist that I recently worked with really just needed one little simple change in the way they write music to completely open up a new direction. And that was something that I, as a producer, was able to point out when I started listening to the songs they had. What ended up happening is that over the course of years and years of like playing guitar and writing songs, without even realizing it, they had gotten into this habit of using the same exact strumming pattern on guitar. So what ended up happening is that a lot of the songs, as great as they were, they started sort of like blend together and bleed together, and they all started sounding very similar to each other. They hadn't realized that until I pointed it out. I literally just said, here's your homework. Go home and write some songs and force yourself to not use that guitar strumming pattern. And that was the basis, that was kind of like the Kickstarter to writing the new album. And it immediately just all cylinders just started firing off, and some really great songs came out of that, just out of avoiding one simple like strumming pattern. So a producer can help in that sense too. Another reason you should be using a producer is if you need somebody to push you across the finish line. Maybe you're great at self-producing, you have a great sound, you're writing great songs, but you are constantly falling into this hole of self-doubt, or kind of being wishy-washy about how you feel about the songs, and you change directions and you can never stick to a specific release date, and maybe your stuff just lives on a hard drive. A producer can help be the person to guide you over the finish line and actually help reassure you that what you do have is great. Now, the last reason, and I think the most common reason why maybe you would want to use a producer, is because your stuff sounds demo-y. That's the best way I could describe it. There's so many great songwriters out there that just don't have the engineering chops or the production chops to make their stuff sound the way it sounds in their head. At the end of the day, that's what you want. You want a producer to get what you're hearing in your head out onto a computer and out onto Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you want to put it. Maybe it's vinyl, whatever. You want it to sound like what you're hearing in your head. And that's something that a producer can ultimately do. So I would say if you're hitting any of these marks, don't be afraid to reach out to a producer. You know, they're everywhere. And it doesn't even need to be like a perfect real title. A friend of yours that's in another band who has the ability to record might be a great producer and they don't even know it. Like, I got into producing almost by accident. I wanted to produce, but I didn't think I could produce. And then I started producing just because friends knew that I knew how to record stuff, and at some point it stopped being like me just hitting record and it started being me suggesting musical ideas and so on and so forth. And luckily now it's gotten to the point where people have actually wanted me to produce their EPs and their records, and that's an awesome feeling. So I hope this wasn't too long-winded. I hope it answered some ideas about what it takes to be a producer, what a producer does, who they are, whatever, you know what I mean. So yeah, got really ranty really quick. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to be doing more of these. I'll do some more technical tutorials throughout the week. So if you liked it, subscribe, like it, whatever, all that stuff for the YouTube algorithm. You know how it works. Anyways, thanks for checking this out. See you soon.